we just give the Lord another round of applause? And as you're taking your seat, can you just give someone a pound if you're comfortable? If you're not, sorry. I'm sure there was a better explanation for that. All right. Let's get into this. Well, welcome to church. We're so glad you guys are here. And it's a privilege to be able to serve you in this manner. And if there's any way we can serve you guys, let us know. You can find us at hello@mosaicchurchnj.com. And we really just want to be of service to you and bless you as much as we can. Today we're going to be going through, starting a new series called Redemption, or Road to Redemption. And we're going to be digging into that idea, and we're going to be breaking apart just a couple different ways in which how God redeems us, our story, and so on. And today I want to talk about what is redemption and defining what redemption is, because it can be a theologically and spiritually charged word that can oftentimes go over our heads, and we think sometimes redemption is just forgiveness or reconciliation or just healing, but it's more than that. It's all encompassing. It's salvation, it's freedom, and I want us to start walking into a deeper level of redemption, because I believe God wants to redeem much of your stories, not just for the sake of your healing, but for you guys to walk into your divine purpose and calling. And I believe every single person here who's sitting here today is going to start walking into a level of divine purpose that they've never had before in their life. And it's not going to start with your skills and gifts. It's going to actually start with your, I was on a roll there, trauma story. Sorry to kind of dip there, but I'll explain, okay? So let's go into the passage for today. It's out of John chapter 4. To define simply what redemption is when trauma turns into beauty. It's not a theological thing here. It's not going to be in a textbook. I'm not a psychologist by any means. So I know that word trauma can be a trigger word. I'm a pastor that wants to help pastor his people. But when we think about redemption, oftentimes we think a little short-sighted about what redemption can possibly be. We think it just goes to the extent of healing or reconciliation. We think redemption just goes as far as peace. But redemption actually goes further. Redemption goes to the place of beauty. But what we have to see is that redemption has an arc. It has kind of a pathway. And today I want us to follow that pathway. And the three things that I want to get into is that there's a beginning to redemption, there's a cost to redemption, and there's a life living in redemption. And I believe every single person here is going to be walking in a new level of redemption that they've never known before. And it's not going to start with new skills or new gifts. It's going to start with actually what's already happened, what's already inside. And most likely the code to your divine purpose and divine calling is not somewhere out there in the cloud or stratosphere. It's actually probably something already here that God has already made you uniquely, divinely. And so the beginning of starts with the trauma. Dan Allender, we're actually going to be working out of his book, a book called Redeeming Heartache. It's phenomenal. He says this: the redemption story is many things, but is no less a story about trauma. And that's where it starts. When we talk about and when we think about God's redeeming work over our lives, it starts in the place of trauma, tragedy, or trouble. And we're all looking for a redemption story. We all love a good redemption story. And when we think about trauma and tragedy, that's always the first chapter. It's the first chapter to any redemption story in our lives. It's not the entire story, but it's the first chapter. And when we think about redemption, think about it this way. Have you guys seen the movie Julia Roberts? I'm not Julia Roberts. Pretty Woman with Julia Roberts, right? Yeah, you know that one scene where she goes back into the store and she walks in. When she tried to go in originally, and she wasn't up to par in her fashion, but she goes back in later with all the shopping bags, and she walks into the store and says, "You guys work on commission, right? You guys work on commission, right?" That's redemption. That's the picture of redemption. So we're all looking for a good redemption story because we all carry some sort of trauma, some sort of trouble in our lives. And we think it just ends at peace, but it doesn't. You see, trauma, we can categorize it into three different ways. Trauma can often start with who you are or who you are not. It can start with what you have or what you do not have. And it can also start with what has been or what has not been done to you. Who you are, what you have, and what has been done to you or has not been done to you. And when we think about the story of this Samaritan woman, you see there, her story begins with a trauma. What she's going through, and that, just to give you guys a little bit of context, she's in the heat of the day, going to a well to dig up water for herself, and she's alone. This has a lot of implications. It's not just like us going to the water fountain to getting a sip of water. This is a trek. It's possibly dangerous. And not only that, she's not carrying around an Nalgene to fill herself whenever she gets thirsty. It is a trek to get there, and it could be costly for her life, but she's doing it all by herself. She's doing it in the heat of the day. Why? Because she herself carries a trauma. Jesus exposes that, and he sees that, and he talks about that openly and honestly. But you see in her story, it begins with a trauma. And not only that, she's a Samaritan, but she's also a woman. Samaritans and Jews had a very contentious relationship. They were like half-bloods. They were considered not to be pure in the eyes of Jews. And so there was always a contentious relationship between the two. But the Samaritan woman, she had a particular unique kind of trauma. She wasn't just alienated and estranged from the Jews, but she was also alienated and estranged from her own people. She was alone. She carried a unique type of trauma with her in her life. And we have to see her story from the perspective of redemption. You can't see the story from the perspective of trauma. We oftentimes kind of have become attached to seeing our story in the light of trauma rather than the light of redemption. We like to see our stories from the perspective of the battle rather than the perspective of the victory, right? That was a great song right there, Shannon, picking an awesome song. Let's give Shannon a round of applause. Yeah. Not only does Jesus get a round of applause, but our worship leaders as well. Hey now. But she carried a particular type of trauma as she was walking to the well. And for her, oftentimes, and from us, we can carry the story of trauma. And even though that's just the beginning, we have to be able to look at our story, our life, our outline in the perspective of redemption. You see, the beginning for your redemption story, it doesn't happen with perfection. It happens with tragedy and trouble. I remember one of my earlier traumas growing up. This was right around pre-K. One of the things that I was going to my, what's it called? It's not an elementary school. Pre-K school? Preschool, yeah. I was going to my pre-K school, or preschool, and I remember one of the first experiences that I ever had was I went up to a bunch of kids, and I got pushed down the stairs. And the kids told me, "We don't play with Chinese kids." Yeah, I know. I can kind of laugh about it now. It still hurts though. But that is universally the kind of trauma that's it's like a universal trauma. It's a big, heavy trauma. We all look at that and we're like, "Oh man, that's messed up," especially in this kind of climate right now. But there's also smaller kinds of trauma, or the more unseen kinds of trauma, that don't necessarily make as much of a splash, but they have as deep of an impact. Another kind of trauma that I had growing up was moving to different schools. And half of you may be like, yeah, I can understand that. That's quite traumatic. Especially for a guy like myself, that had a little bit hard time making friends and so on. I definitely had this traumatic experience of changing schools every single time. But that trauma is unique to me. Want to know why? Because I remember when I was talking to my wife about moving schools, and I'm pouring out my heart. I kind of want the response of the universal trauma. Oh, man. And I'm sharing with her, man, I had to change schools here, there, at that point in my life. Woe is me. My wife, she looks at me, she goes, I loved changing schools. I loved it. It was a fresh start every time. And I'm like almost weeping. I'm sucking those tears back in and being like, yeah, I'm not weak. No. You could have 10 people go through the same exact event. And it may not be a unique event, but since every single person is unique in themselves, they'll experience that situation in a completely different way. What was traumatic for me was enjoyable to my wife. It is a unique kind of trauma. And it's not just a generalization that has to be blanketed over every single person and the body of Christ. No, it is a unique kind of experience that every single person has gone through in their own life. So you can look at that story, right? You can look at the difference between me and my wife going through changing schools and my own personal responses and her personal responses. You can look at that and say, you know what? Maybe that's just a blanket trauma experience. But not necessarily. What if, just what if, she and I were made in a way to respond to that kind of situation uniquely, but also divinely? That story, that experience marked me. And it actually shaped how I even do ministry here today. The beginning of your redemption story doesn't start with perfection. It doesn't start with your improvement, your growth. It doesn't start with your peace. It starts with trauma. Next here, there's a cost to redemption. Redemption is pricey. It's not free. It's never free. It costs someone something. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7, Paul says this, in whom we have redemption through his blood. And what Paul's talking about, he's talking about the price of redemption. But more specifically, he's talking about this practice called manumission. Manumission, what that was, it was the redeeming of slaves, basically people who would buy themselves out of slavery. And this is first century slavery. It's very different than historical American slavery. That was not right. This is what, when Paul's talking about slavery here and referencing this idea called manumission, he's referencing more so towards indentured servitude. Basically, during that time, there was no such things as banks, and there was no way you can take a loan out and then try to slowly pay your way back. If you borrow money from somebody, you had to pay them back, and the way you did that, if you didn't have the funds to do it, you just put yourself into their service, and until you slowly paid back your debt, you were an indentured servant to them. And so that redemption payment, when you buy yourself out of that servitude, what that is called is that's manumission. And what Paul's referencing is when he's talking about redemption through his blood, he's saying you have been bought out of slavery. Your bondage has been broken, not by your good works, not by your skills, but through the blood of Jesus Christ. I was talking about this yesterday. He could have saved us with a paper cut. That would have been enough. But he poured himself out completely. He lavished us extravagantly with every ounce of his blood, to the point where he had no more anymore. He just had water spewing out of himself. That's the kind of price that he was willing to pay for our redemption. That's the kind of value that he placed on you and me. I don't know about you guys, but there's very few things that I'm willing to bleed for. I could probably count it on my fingers. 4, my children. 5, my wife, right? That wasn't an accident, that was intentional. But other than that, when I get a paper cut, I never want to go through that again. It wasn't worth it. But for Jesus, he put a price on our lives, and he said, this is how much I value you. That's how valuable you are. The value of your life is dependent on how much someone's willing to pay for you. And so Jesus, he was willing to shed himself completely of his blood. And the weight of redemption, the weight to redeem yourself out of slavery, out of bondage, is a weight that's way too heavy for any of us to carry. But we're all trying to do it. We're all trying to redeem ourselves somehow. We're trying to redeem ourselves by making ourselves successful in whatever realm that you want to be successful. It could be relationally, it could be financially, it could be even in your own faith. You're trying to triumph in your faith. And so you're trying to redeem yourself. But the weight and the cost of redemption is way too heavy for your own life. Yeah. But we're trying to carry it. The Samaritan woman, she was trying to carry the weight of her own redemption. She looked at Jesus and said, where can I find this living water? I'm seeking this Messiah, and when he comes, he'll tell me all the answers. She's carrying the weight of her own redemption, so what does she do? She walks to the water by herself in order to get it by herself so that she doesn't have to deal with other people. Being a social pariah. She's trying to carry the weight of her own redemption. Redemption, your redemption, is way too costly. We can't carry it on our own. It costs too much. She's trying to carry her own weight, and she'll eventually be crushed by it. That crushing feeling that we experience and that we go through, that crushing experience is not the weight of the world on us. It's the weight of us trying to carry our own redemption out of our own story. We're trying to make something of our lives, trying to make something of ourselves, trying to cover up the trauma and the trouble, to avoid it as much as we can. And some of us have done a very good job of covering up over our trauma. So, going back, my own trauma, pre-K trauma experience, right? You know what that did for me? That made me place myself as a perpetual stranger on the outside looking in. That placed me in a place where I wanted to earn my way into social circles. And I wasn't good at it either, but that was my perspective. And so what did I have to do? I had to fundamentally change myself. I had to be willing to sacrifice myself to be able to get into certain places, certain circles, to be accepted. The cost of redemption was way too heavy. And the cost of your own redemption is way too heavy. The last part here, the life of redemption. And this is the kicker here. This is the most important part. So if you've been sleeping, you might want to wake up. The life of redemption is simply a life of beauty. And let me define that. If trauma can start with who you are or who you're not, if it can start with what has been done to you or what has not been done to you, if it can start with in those places, then the redemptive arc, the redemptive story of your life has to end with beauty. Yeah. And when we think about beauty, beauty is just, and that's why I use the word beauty. I was wrestling through all the different kinds of words I can use. I was thinking purpose or calling or joy or peace. But it's all of that. It's the beauty of your life, your existence. And when we are able to start walking into the beauty of our existence, the pathway into it is not through peace and perfection, but the pathway into it, the start of it, is through trauma, tragedy, and trouble. It doesn't start with perfection. However, the life of beauty is not one where we have deleted the memory of the trauma and the trouble, but it's you've been released from the tyranny of it. You'll never forget. I mean, there's few cases where I've seen people completely forget certain traumatic experiences. But most people will not forget it. They cannot forget it. So the memory will be there. But the life of beauty is not one where the memory is erased and gone. But the life of beauty is when you've been released, when you've broken through from the bondage of the tyranny of that tragedy. And that's what oftentimes the hardest part of trauma is. It's like an oppressive, tyrannical dictator coming into your life, dictating everything that happens, choosing everything that happens. And there's oftentimes when you are sober-minded enough to know, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be in this relationship. I don't want to keep on doing this sort of thing. I want to break through, but I just can't. I can't. That's the weight and the tyranny of trauma. The life of beauty is when you've been released from it, when you've been broken free from it. And here's the thing. In this long passage that we went through, you see a woman go from trauma to redemption. But look at what she says at the end of at verses 39 and 40. What does she say? She says, "He told me everything I did." Think about that. Everything she did that change? No. Everything she did, everything that happened to her, everything she's done, everything of who she is, did that change? No. So how was it that let's just put that everything she did just in this figurative box, right? Everything she did, how is it that everything in this box, all before she met Jesus, was a cause of social outcasting, alienation, estrangement, abandonment, and even her own life's threatened, the cost of her own life, right? How was it that that box, all of a sudden, that was causing so much trauma and tragedy, is now the method to which Jesus uses to bring people to himself? That box didn't change. That box didn't change. The trauma didn't change. The story didn't change. But after she met Jesus, she was able to go back to all of her people, the Samaritan village, take the box, put it in front of her, put it in front of them and say, yeah, this man Jesus, yeah, he did something with that. The beautiful part of all this is not that the trauma, that this box gets deleted and gets thrown out. The beautiful part is that that trauma is no longer pointing to herself. That trauma is pointing to Jesus. When that trouble is a burden that you carry, it brings shame, it brings guilt, it brings you to put yourself into some really compromising situations. When you try to carry that, what you're going to try to do inevitably is cover that up. So you cover it up by trying to make a lot of money. You cover it up by trying to find the perfect relationship. You cover it up by trying to force your kids to become things that you never could be. Oof, parents, that's real. I struggle with that. I struggle with that. So when that trauma and that box of trauma is pointing at you, you yourself cannot handle it. It's a burden that's way too heavy. But when that trauma is now pointing at Jesus, then you're set free. Then you know the life of beauty. So before, she went to everybody, And everybody knew everything she did, clearly. And that caused her to hide. Because that trauma was just constantly pointing at her. But after Jesus, that trauma, that trouble, that tragedy was no longer pointing at her. It was pointing at Jesus. And somehow that gave her the courage to bring everyone in her village, all these people who alienated her, who cast her out. Somehow that gave her the courage to be able to bring all of them and say, meet this man named Jesus. He told me everything I did. Redemption is when trauma turns into beauty. And that pathway from trauma to beauty is not going to happen by us covering up our own troubles, covering up our issues. It's going to happen when those issues, that trouble, tragedy, and trauma starts pointing at something else other than you. That's the life of beauty. So for me, growing up, this experience of a perpetual stranger, constant foreigner, it is a real experience for many Asians in society, in American society, even now. And I never realized this, but before we started this church, I've been doing ministry for almost 10 years, and I never noticed this, but I always had a leaning towards the stranger. I always had a leaning towards the stranger. And even for our own team here, I have to apologize oftentimes because I'll be talking with like Shannon or something, and if there's a stranger that comes through, I literally will just walk out of the conversation to go talk to them. Why? Because my heart and my hope is that no one will feel like a stranger here. And even biblically speaking, in the kingdom, there are no strangers. In the kingdom, there are no strangers. That's one of our core values here at Mosaic. There are no strangers. When you walk into this room, we're going to treat you like extended family. I'm going to treat you like my cousin's wife or husband or whatever. I'm going to treat you like that because in the kingdom, there are no strangers. And so for me to go through that experience as a perpetual stranger growing up, that shaped my ministry. That shaped how we do welcoming, how we do hospitality. That's why we don't call each other greeters, when those beautiful faces who are welcoming. Can we give the greeters a round of applause? I made the mistake. They're not greeters, they're connectors. Because we want to connect with you. We want to pray for you, even if it's our first conversation. And I don't care how awkward it is, really. There's no strangers. That's why even when I'm talking to any one of us, I'll pull someone else into the conversation like, hey, Shannon, meet this person. Why? Because there's no strangers here. What we're doing is just introducing ourselves to extended family. So for me, as going through that experience of a stranger, the redemptive aspect of it is not that my trauma gets covered up and deleted from my life forever. But it's those initial stories that are able to build into what God has for my divine purpose, destiny, and calling. My responsibility here in this church is not as preacher, it's not even just as pastor, but it's to be a connector with every single person here. So this is more of a preface or a disclaimer. If I ever jump out of a conversation with you, don't take that the wrong way. That just means I see us as close enough for me to be able to do something like that, all right? Please do not be offended if all of a sudden I jump out of a conversation. Why? Because I know what it feels like to be a stranger. I know what it feels like to look in the inside from the outside. And my heart will always lean towards that, unashamedly. And that started not because I read the Bible and had this amazing vision for what hospitality can look like at Mosaic. It started when I was 4 years old, being rejected from the inside and making sure that no one else feels like that for the rest of my life. Your redemption story is not one where we cover up the trauma. It's not one where we lose it. It's not one where we even avoid trouble. It's one where we start walking into the beauty, the purpose, the divine destiny that God has for us. And the pathway, my friends, the pathway, it starts with trauma, trouble, and tragedy. Yeah. Let's pray. He told me everything I ever did. Feel the weight of that statement. He told me everything that has been done to me. He told me everything that I am and that I am not. Jesus had this peculiar way of being able to connect with people, to spend time with people who were on the complete opposite spectrum of gender, religion, theology, politics, and for them to not feel for 1 second judged, for 1 second condemned. Jesus had that gift about him. Every single one of us, we have a unique trauma, a unique trouble. We all carry something. For me, it was being called a Chinese kid, even though I was Korean. Initially, I didn't cry about it. I've never cried about it. I'm not Chinese, okay, fine. But it carries with you. We all carry a unique trauma. 10 people could go through the exact same thing, and they could all walk out of it differently. Why? Because you have been uniquely made, divinely designed. And the way we start walking into our divine purpose is being able to understand the unique ways in which we've been troubled and realizing maybe, just maybe, God made me this way. Maybe God designed me this way. Not for my own good, for redemptive history to happen. I believe this church was birthed out of a heart to make sure that no one feels like a stranger, because there are no strangers in the kingdom. So as you worship, as you give your life to Jesus, as you worship Jesus, as you follow Jesus, know that he's saying the same exact thing to you. And all he wants is to be able to carry your trauma, trouble, and tragedy, because he can. He who knew no sin became sin for us. He has that ability. He can carry it. You can't. So let's all rise and let's just take a moment and let's just love on Jesus. He paid a costly price